Hey guys! Part 9 of What If Naruto Graduates 2 Years Early. Hit like and subscribe if you like this one, and also please check the author in the description. Let's start.
We are pain, that's all. We are God.
Chapter 39, Tsunade Retrieval, No More Sacrifices. Closer. Closer. Tsunade thought as Orochimaru had managed to force his arms to move to reach out for the sphere of chakra she had created. Any second now, the deed would be done, the Sannin would truly be separated forever, and she would see Dan and Nawaki again soon when she followed her teammate into death. She had almost been willing to do a most heinous thing in order to have Dan and Nawaki by her side in life, where she knew for a fact that she would be able to see and hold them again. Instead, she would have faith that they would be waiting for her on the other side. She wasn't as good, or as strong a person as Dan and Nawaki had been. She had been weak. Because she had been weak, she had almost been willing to drag Dan and Nawaki back into this world in spite of any feelings they might have had about her doing so. Almost. Suddenly, there was a kunai sailing through the air, and Orochimaru had leapt back away from the sphere of energy that would have been his death, as it shredded him apart from the inside rather than healed him the instant he came into contact with it. She had forgotten about Orochimaru's assistant. South close. South close. I honestly hadn't expected you to betray me like this, Tsunade, Orochimaru said. I really would have brought Dan and Nawaki back. I know, she replied. I was almost weak enough to allow you to do it too, despite any wishes they may have had in that regard. I miss them so much and would have given almost anything to hold them in my arms again, but not this. I will be joining them anyways soon after I deal with you. With that, she attacked, not really caring that Orochimaru and his bastard assistant, who was also a medical nin, if what he'd said was any indication, were leading her into a place that would be more advantageous for them. All that mattered was destroying Orochimaru before he destroyed the home that Dan and Nawaki had sacrificed themselves for. She would be seeing them again soon, and she wanted to say at the very least that she had died protecting their home just as they had. She had almost forgotten what their wishes would have been in her desperation to see them again, just as she had almost forgotten how to be the person that they had loved. If she hadn't gone to say goodbye to Jiraiya, and possibly spike his drink so he wouldn't follow her today, she probably would have made a different choice, but she hoped that she would not have. She hoped that regardless, she would have thought of Dan and Nawaki's wishes in the end, just as Shizen had constantly begged her to. Just once, she wanted to be strong like she used to be, like Dan, Nawaki, Minato, and Kushina had been. Jiraiya and Naruto had been talking about her when she had found him last night. Naruto had had his doubts about his new Hokage, and Jiraiya had defended her, telling Naruto of the good, kind, and strong person who had vanished long ago and left a washed-up old gambler behind. She wanted to be that person again, that person Jiraiya had spoken about in such glowing terms, that person that Dan and Nawaki had loved, if only for a moment. When she met Dan and Nawaki again on the other side, she wanted to be able to tell them that her death had actually meant something, rather than that she died drunk in a ditch somewhere, as a dried-up old hag. Jiraiya heaved a sigh of relief when he saw signs of a battle at the meeting place, rather than Tsunade and a fully healed Orochimaru. It seemed that some deity somewhere was smiling down on him. He wouldn't be losing Tsunade the way he feared he would. Tsunade would not be dying by his hand on this day, or any other day for that matter. Let's go, he said to Shizen and Naruto as he turned to follow the trail of destruction that led to the battlefield on which Tsunade was currently located, fighting their former comrade. Even though it made him slightly sick to do so, he would fight Orochimaru. He would help Tsunade fight Orochimaru, and this time they would kill him. They would kill him together the way they should have done more than a decade ago. If they had killed Orochimaru then Sensei would still be Hokage, and still be waiting for the proper moment to hand Naruto the hat and retiring once more. He would not have had to come here and try to force Tsunade to take a job she had never wanted, because it was a job he knew he couldn't handle, and would run away from at the first opportunity. Tsunade, however, when Tsunade had something she felt obligated to do, she would do it no matter how she really felt about it. At least that was how the Tsunade he knew had been. He raced ahead, hoping that they would get there in time since Orochimaru most assuredly was not alone. Naruto and Shizen trailed behind. He would have much rather have left them behind, but they might be needed. Orochimaru watched as Kabuto battled Tsunade. Sure, she seemed strong and confident now, but he knew exactly how to pull the wind out of her sails and sap her fighting spirit. If all else failed, Kabuto had been instructed to use the easiest technique to do so. Once Kabuto did so, Tsunade would effectively remove herself from the battle for the same reason that she had been pulled out of the field during the Third Shinobi War. For now, he would let her believe that she was bold, brave, and fierce. It would make her defeat, and the final breaking of her spirit that came with it all the more sweeter when it happened. After she fell to her weakness, and was unable to rise again, he would oh so kindly guide her back to his home where she would do as he'd asked like she should have done in the first place. He hadn't wanted to have to break his former teammate, but if that was what it took. Tsunade charged forward once more. She had yet to lay a finger on even a single strand of Orochimaru's hair. Orochimaru's assistant was young and quick. She, on the other hand, was 50 years old, even though she didn't look it, and wasn't anywhere near as fast as she had been when she was that boy's age. Her age and her lifestyle had taken its toll on her. She wasn't nearly as strong or as fast as she used to be. As she was beginning to tire, the boy popped a food pill of some sort, created a pair of chakra scalpels, and kicked the fight up a notch. In one quick move, he'd evaded one of her attacks and used the scalpels to sever a muscle in her arm and another one in her leg. After hampering her in this manner, he used the chakra scalpels to sever a muscle in her chest, severely reducing the amount of air she could take in, and further weakening her. This had caused the boy to become overconfident, and that had been his undoing. She used a rather sneaky attack that involved messing up the signals the brain sent to the limbs when his guard was down. Even if the boy managed to adapt, he wouldn't be as fast as he had been. It still hadn't been enough, though. After a while of experimenting with his movements and figuring out how to compensate, he was back on his feet and attacking. Just when she thought that she would fall to his onslaught, Jiraiya, Shizen, and Naruto appeared, giving her a moment to recover. "So that's how it is then, Kabuto?" Naruto asked her opponent, sounding upset and betrayed. "Yes, that's how it is, Naruto. And I just can't wait until I've got you on my exam table when this is over. You and I will have so much fun together." "Not if I kill you first," Naruto replied. Before Naruto, who looked so much like Nawaki, could attack the much stronger opponent and get himself killed the way Nawaki had, she attacked again, giving it all she had. When she backed him into a corner, and it looked like she would actually win, he sliced his hand open and flung the blood that came out all over her. "Stop! Stop! Stop! No! Dan, don't leave me! Not now! Oh God! Dan! No!" She barely noticed when she was flung backwards, or when Shizen began tending to her. All she could see was blood. Dan's blood staining and coating her hands that failed to save him. Blood. Nawaki's blood staining the sheet that had covered him. Blood. Blood that turned the ground of every battlefield red. She didn't really pay any attention as both sides sized each other up and exchanged battle banter in hopes of knocking the other off balance without landing a blow. She didn't really pay attention when Orochimaru's assistant summoned a pair of serpents for Orochimaru, and Jiraiya had summoned one of his larger toads and rode into battle against their teammate. She wasn't watching when Shizen moved in to fight Orochimaru's assistant. All she could see was blood. Blood dripping and staining everything. She barely noticed when Shizen was defeated, and Orochimaru's apprentice started in on her. All she saw was blood. Dan's blood. Nawaki's blood. Blood flowing from the injuries that her unconscious assistant had acquired fighting the boy who was assaulting her. The next thing she knew was that Naruto was standing in front of her, blocking Kabuto's blows. "I won't let you hurt the Hokage," Naruto yelled as a sphere of blue energy formed in his hand, a sphere of blue energy that she had last seen the boy's father using. "Are you really going to stand there and tell me that you'd give your life to protect that?" Orochimaru's assistant said. "Look at her, she's sitting there trembling like a small child. She's unfit to bear the title Sannin, much less Hokage. It doesn't matter what I feel, Naruto said as he attacked Orochimaru's assistant. I swore an oath to the old man that I would protect my village and my Hokage, and I won't go back on it no matter what. Orochimaru's assistant dodged Naruto's attacked Naruto with a chakra scalpel, and took out one of the boy's leg muscles. Despite the fact that he was partially immobilized and completely outclassed, Naruto continued to fight, continued to protect her, despite the fact that she was obviously completely unworthy of such regard. As she watched the boy fight, all she could see was Nawaki under the sheet, and Dan lying on the ground after being fatally wounded because he had taken an attack that had been meant for her. I will become Hokage to protect grandfather's village. And that's why I decided to become Hokage, to protect the village. I swore I would become Hokage one day, and that's one promise that only death will make me go back on. Why? Why? Why was it that the people who deserved such sacrifices made on their behalf died instead? Why was it that the unworthy ones like her survived? Naruto managed to capture the other boy's hand, and drive a Rasengan into his chest. In the moment that Naruto did this, Orochimaru's assistant drove a chakra scalpel into his chest. The boy stood for a moment before coughing up blood and falling over. No! No! Nobody else should die for her, especially not Minato and little Kushina's son. Even though the boy was fading fast, she poured healing chakra into him, determined not to let this become a repeat of the day Dan died. It seemed useless though, as Naruto's pulse and breathing stopped entirely. No! She wouldn't let him die. Not now! In the moment she thought it was over, she felt a hand brush against her arm. She looked down and found herself staring in amazement. Despite the fact that he should be dead right now, the child was alive. He was breathing. As she rechecked the boy's condition, the battle between Orochimaru and Jiraiya that had been winding down finally came to an end when Orochimaru fled, saying that he would use another method to fix his arms, and swearing to destroy Konoha. The still seriously injured Kabuto, who had taken the full force of Naruto's Rasengan, and somehow still managed to survive, followed. As Orochimaru was weak, and Jiraiya was at full strength, fleeing had been the only outcome that would be even vaguely in Orochimaru's favor, especially after Jiraiya and his summon had destroyed Orochimaru's snakes. The battle was done, Orochimaru had escaped yet again, and it was now time to go home. They would catch Orochimaru again one day, and when they did, they would finally kill him. Even though she wasn't worthy of the title that had belonged to her sensei only a month ago, she would take the job. She would take the job, and do her best to protect the village that Dan and Nawaki had given their lives for. She would make sure that Orochimaru wouldn't destroy their home no matter how much he wanted to. She would protect their home like she should have been from the beginning, rather than throwing her life away in a variety of gambling dens, trying to forget her brother and her boyfriend, and the sacrifices they had made. Chapter 40 – Return to Konoha. The journey back to Konoha was relatively uneventful. They had met no other enemies on the road, and made it back to the village in near record time. To Naruto, the Godame Hokage seemed like an almost completely different person from the bitter drunk he'd met a week earlier. She stood tall and proud, and there was no sign of the shaking she had been doing in the fight against Orochimaru. Not until he'd scratched his arm and started bleeding, that was. Based on Tsunade's shudders, the hemophobia had not entirely vanished. If one didn't know about the drinking, the gambling, and the hemophobia, Tsunade was almost a picture of what a Hokage should be. Stern, serious-looking, straight, and proud. She certainly had the proper pedigree for the position, considering the fact that the current Kages were mostly blood relatives of a prior Kage of their respective village. He just hoped that it wouldn't go as badly as he feared it would. Konoha needed a strong Hokage right now, or at the very least the semblance of one, since the village was currently rather vulnerable at the moment. Fortunately, Tsunade's reputation as one of the Sannin preceded her. When he got home, it was to find Konohamaru expressing his grief over his grandfather's death by trying to prevent a couple Chunin from removing his grandfather's belongings from the Hokage's residence and office. When he'd left Konoha, Konohamaru had been trying to hide how upset he'd been about the old man's death. It seemed that he had finally left the denial stage and moved into anger. While the other ninja were reluctant to deal with Konohamaru, Tsunade didn't indulge the boy. It was quite possible that there had been a similar incident in her past when either her grandfather or her great-uncle had died. After Tsunade had had Konohamaru thrown out of the room he'd booby-trapped, and the tower altogether for that matter, he had spent his afternoon trying to comfort the boy. Nothing he did seemed to work. He was beginning to understand how Konohamaru must have felt when he'd been going through his bad days. Konohamaru would come around eventually, however. Shizen was happy to see the home she hadn't been back to in a very long time. Her faith in Tsunade had recently been restored. It had been slowly slipping for a long time until a couple of days ago. For years it had seemed that her teacher hadn't cared for her or her opinion. No matter how many times she had tried to get Tsunade to listen to her, the woman had gone off and done whatever the hell she wanted come hell or high water. During the incident that had restored her faith in Tsunade, she thought that she wasn't listening to her at all. She thought Tsunade would make the worst mistake ever, and that thousands of innocent people would have to pay for it. It turned out that Tsunade had heard her words and heeded them, even though she hadn't appeared to do so. The entire week between when Orochimaru had made his oh so tempting offer, and the day Tsunade refused it, she had asked Tsunade what Dan and Nawaki would have wanted. Every time she asked, Tsunade either yelled at her to shut up or walked away. Instead of betraying the village that Dan and Nawaki had sacrificed themselves for in order to bring them back as she had feared she would, Tsunade had listened to her, had considered what Dan and Nawaki would have wanted, and had done the right thing. Not only that, she had accepted the position of Hokage in order to protect Konoha as they would have wanted her to do. The Tsunade who had come back to Konoha was a person she could get behind, a person she would loyally serve for as long as she lived, a person it was an honor to assist rather than an obligation. She would do her part to help Tsunade be the best Hokage that it was possible for her to be. That was the future, however. For now, though, she would wander the village, reacquainting herself with the home that had been fading in her memory over the many years she had been away. Tsunade shivered as she walked through the corridors of the hospital. Though she couldn't see it, she could smell it. There was blood here. It was all over, though it was well hidden. She couldn't let it paralyze her, though. She had come here for a purpose. As she had been getting herself acquainted with her new office and coming duties, Mato Guy had shown up and begged her on bended knee to go and help Kakashi. The man had fallen victim to a genjutsu that had been cast by Uchiha Itachi, and had been in a coma for nearly a month. Genjutsu damage was hellishly tricky to repair as there was very little physical damage involved, but she and Uchiha Kagami had been working on methods for dealing with it before he died. One of their experiments on a prisoner from IWA who had fallen into his own little world after falling victim to an exceedingly traumatic genjutsu that had turned his worst fears against him before he'd been captured on the field of battle had shown a great deal of promise. She wasn't certain if it was a full cure though, as the man had been exchanged for a couple Konoha ninja before she could do any long-term studies. It would be the method she and Kagami had devised that she would use in hopes of waking Kakashi up. Since there didn't seem to be anything else the medics could do, this could be Kakashi's only hope. Hopefully, it wouldn't turn out to be a fool's hope. If Kakashi managed to awaken, he would have to undergo a great deal of therapy in order to recover from whatever had happened in the genjutsu world in which he'd been placed. There were no guarantees that Kakashi would undergo the therapy though. Ninja tended to be rather averse to such things, and trying to force them made them all the more determined to escape. Fortunately for her nerves, Kakashi wasn't bleeding, nor was there a sign that he'd been bleeding recently. There was no blood. There would be no blood during the procedure. She could do this. The method that she and Kagami had developed had been to counter the genjutsu with another genjutsu. She would plant a guide that would lead Kakashi out of whatever hell he was trapped in, and back into the real world. Before doing that, however, she healed the physical damage to his brain that had been caused by the attack and the month-long coma that had followed. Once the small amount of damage was corrected, she sent out her guide, which she was certain that Kakashi would latch onto, as there was no reason for the man to be there in whatever world Itachi had constructed for him. If that guide didn't work for whatever reason, she would send another. The guide she sent was a basic mental image of a person who was important to the victim. It would have the sole purpose of leading the person out of whatever corner of their mind they had retreated to, and back into the real world. While the initial image was basic, just that of a person that the medic selected, such as a father, mother, teacher, or teammate, it would be complete when it reached the genjutsu victim, as they would be filling in any necessary details themselves. Once she put the genjutsu into place, she sat back to wait. Before long, Hatake Kakashi's eyes fluttered open. Based on the way his eyes were scanning the room, he was awake, alert, and aware of his surroundings. Good. She would have to keep him here for several days of observation, though. As she prepared to leave, a medic came up to her and informed her that Kakashi's student Uchiha Sasuke was in much the same condition. She went to the boys' room to find Naruto and a pink-haired girl he introduced to her as his teammate Haruno Sakura there discussing something. From the looks of things, Sakura had visited the room fairly often. "What are you going to do?" the Haruno girl asked when she had mentioned that she was going to help Sasuke. She explained the procedure to the two children. Both seemed to be able to follow her. "Who are you going to send?" Naruto asked. "I was thinking of sending in one of his teammates, since sending in a parent might be traumatic," she admitted. That might not be a good idea," Naruto replied. "Why not?" she asked. "Well, with the state Sasuke's in, either one of us could drive him away. I don't really get along with him, and the feeling's mutual on his part. No offense meant to Sakura, but though she's improved over the last few months, she's a rabid Sasuke fangirl, and he really doesn't like those. Would it be possible for him to choose his own guide?" Naruto replied. "That might be possible," she conceded. The world of darkness that he'd been in for either a moment, or an eternity, or both began to recede. When he looked down at his hands, he found that he was the same size he had been during the massacre. "Oh God! Not again!" he thought. Instead of turning into that horrible blood-red world where his clan fell around him, he found himself standing on the lakeside dock where his father had taught him how to use the Gokyaku Jutsu. As he studied his surroundings, he could see the final wisps of flame from the jutsu he'd done that day dying over the water. Suddenly, his father was standing there just as he had that day. He remembered this day, the day his father had asked him not to follow in his brother's footsteps. He hadn't understood why at the time, because he dearly loved and admired that man. Now he did. Had his father known what that man was back then? Had he seen the signs of what was to come? "Sasuke," his father said, "it's time to go home." Home? Had Itachi actually killed him when he used the Tsukuyomi on him again? Had he died without realizing it? He followed his father, wondering if he died without avenging the clan and whether or not his father would be disappointed in him for failing to do so. Instead of following the familiar path to the home his family had once shared, his father had walked out of the Uchiha district and into the village. "This isn't the way home," he said, as he turned back onto the path towards their house. "Yes, it is," his father said, continuing down the road through the village. He didn't follow, however. He made his way back to the house their family shared, both hoping and dreading what he might find there. His mother stood outside the house sweeping the porch. "Sasuke, you're not supposed to be here," his mother said. "You're supposed to be going home." "But this is home, Ka-san," he replied. "No, it isn't, sweetheart," his mother said sadly. "After Itachi used the Tsukuyomi on you, you withdrew in on yourself. I'm here to guide you back to the real world where you belong." "Why can't I stay here with you?" he asked, reluctant to leave this place where his parents and clan were alive. Had he remained in that dark place, he would have been more than happy to leave. Here, however. "Who's going to restore the clan if you stay here?" his mother asked. "That was one of your two main goals in life, wasn't it? You can't restore the clan if you're hiding here. Technically you could, but an outsider would be raising your children, and an outsider would be saying what a Uchiha is and isn't." He felt torn. What his mother said was true, though. If he stayed here, he wouldn't be able to restore his clan, or avenge it. "Let's get you home," his mother said, setting the broom beside the house. He reluctantly followed her into the village. As he did so, he found himself wondering why the representation of his inner self was Konoha. It's what you're most familiar with, his mother said, replying to his unasked question. The path home could be anything. For you, Konoha is home, so the path home is Konoha. If that was the case, then either the academy or the library would represent learning and knowledge. Perhaps he could find an answer to the question he'd been asking himself while that man tortured him in one of those two places. Perhaps he would find an answer that he'd forgotten or overlooked while he was doing exactly what that man had told him to do in his pursuit of vengeance. Apologizing to his mother, he turned off the path home and ran for the library. When he reached the library, he found it to be somewhat disorganized for some strange reason. Not only that, but several books had locks on them. One lock appeared to have been broken, and when he flipped through the book with the broken lock, he found that it was his memory of the night of the massacre, the memory of the first time his Sharingan had activated, the memory of that man crying as he fled into the night. He grabbed another of the books. This one was still locked. He tried to pry the lock open, but it wouldn't budge. Damn it, Sasuke. I told you to stay out of here. Surest way, deal with this. I wouldn't keep trying to open that if I were you, said a voice he vaguely recognized. It was an elderly librarian who had been killed during the massacre. You won't like what you find. But, he said, he found that he had a burning desire to know what the book contained. Some things are best forgotten, the librarian said as she snatched the book from him and set it on the shelf. This was one of them. You'd best be getting home now, boy. He turned from the library and rather than heading back to the path where he'd left his mother, he ran to the academy. If the library contained memories of the past, then the academy would contain knowledge. Knowledge was always useful. When he reached the academy, he found it virtually empty. There was nobody there, no teachers, no students, nobody except Uzumaki Naruto was prying open the teachers' storage lockers in the faculty lounge. He was dressed in the eye-searing shade of orange that he used to wear back at the academy, back when he was the idiot and the class clown. He'd caught Naruto doing this before. As he watched, the boy opened one of the teacher's lunch boxes, one of the teacher's sealed lunch boxes, and dropped several worms and a grasshopper inside. When he finished his prank, he turned around and seemed to notice him for the first time. What are you doing here, Sasuke? You should be going home, Naruto said. I had thought that I would find a way to become stronger than that man here, he replied, feeling kinda stupid. Why do you want to become stronger than that man? Naruto asked as he led him down a hall that oddly enough didn't lead outside. In order to defeat him and avenge my clan, he replied promptly. Why do you have to be stronger than him to do so? Naruto asked. Because that's how you defeat someone. You become stronger than them, and then you take them down, he replied. Let me ask you something, Naruto said. I in our straight taijutsu only spars, what happens? I win sometimes, and you win sometimes, he replied. In our spars where we aren't limited to taijutsu, what happens? Naruto asked. You win all the time because you cheat, he replied. Since you've acquired the Sharingan, has that changed? Naruto asked. No, he replied reluctantly, remembering the number of ways Naruto had devised for getting around his eyes. Well, there you go, Naruto said as he set up the simple prank that he had gotten Yumino-sensei on his first day as their instructor, the prank that had fooled a fully qualified Chunin who had been much smarter and stronger than Naruto had been at the time. A chalkboard eraser, and a bit of vegetable oil, and an academy student took down a full-fledged Chunin. He had his answer. He could defeat that man without becoming that man. He would have to be trickier rather than stronger. He didn't need to get that man's eyes. He needed to find a way around his eyes. You'd better get going. I think your mother's waiting for you, Naruto said as he carefully rigged the clock with a bit of ninja wire in order to move the hands and change the time as he pleased. He returned to the path. His mother had indeed waited. He told her how much he loved her as he went inside the hospital where his mother had led him. His eyes opened, and he found himself staring at a rather sterile-looking ceiling. He was in a bed. Sakura and Naruto were standing nearby, as was a strange blonde woman he didn't recognize. Chapter 41, A Hokage's Task. Orochimaru-sama? Kabuto said as he approached his master, who was preparing to transfer to a new body, as it would probably take a while to get a hold of Sasuke since he was currently heavily guarded at the hospital. Normally kidnapping the boy and bringing him here wouldn't have been too much of a problem for him, but the new Hokage had changed the entire hospital security system in the wake of his desertion, and he didn't have the new schematics or patrol routes yet. Yes? Orochimaru replied. He was looking rather tired at the moment, and he fully understood. The man was sick and in a great deal of pain. The destruction of Konoha might have to be postponed for a while, he said, deciding to get the worst out of the way, and hoping that Orochimaru didn't kill him due to his current mood. Orochimaru generally wasn't the sort of despot who killed his subordinates at the drop of a hat, at least not deliberately, but the last month or so had been exceedingly trying for him. Why? Orochimaru asked. Oto is currently down by more than 2/3 of our forces, since we poured almost everyone who currently wasn't part of a study into the invasion. I put some feelers out, and after what happened to the Kazekage, none of the other villages are willing to work with us. The Akatsuki turned the job down as well, he replied. How long? Orochimaru asked. 2 years, maybe 3. 4 at the outside. We need to rebuild our forces, and come up with a new plan. The old plan took over a year to create, and is no longer viable, he replied. We will of course be needing updated maps after Konoha finishes rebuilding, since I am almost certain that several streets will be changed now that the opportunity has presented itself since that serpent of yours trashed one of the historical districts. Fine. Whatever, Orochimaru said. Fine? Whatever? Was Orochimaru well? Normally he'd be hopping mad and yelling about such a delay. Did he add to his painkillers without telling anyone again? Was there anything else you wanted? Orochimaru asked, giving him a slightly glassy-eyed look. Crap. He did. And from the looks of it, it was a rather powerful one. He would be having words with anyone who let Orochimaru near the chemistry sets. The lab assistants were supposed to be supervising him while he conducted his experiments to prevent such things. Having patients who could and would make their own medication was, to quote that lazy genin from the last exam, troublesome. Tsunade had thought the inauguration went well. Pretty much all she had to do was stand out on the balcony dressed in her Hokage robes and greet the cheering crowd after her sensei's old teammates had presented her to the general public. After that came the meeting with the clan heads. She could remember when most of them were snot-nosed brats. Hyuga Hayashi was about a decade younger than her, as were Kimichi Chuza and the rest of the original Ino Shikacho team. Inuzuka-tsum was about a decade and a half younger than her. It made her feel old. She hated feeling old. That's one of the reasons that she had kept herself looking young. After the meeting, there had been a rather nice dinner which had been provided by one of the civilian clans that owned a number of restaurants and grocery stores. Yesterday and the inauguration that had come with it had been for partying. Today was for work. There was more than enough of it waiting for her when she arrived at her office that morning. Almost the entire desk had been covered in books and papers that were a result of a month and a half's backlog, which included the extra work all of the rebuilding was creating. As she was filling out paperwork on requested renovations for the Ninja Academy, one of her sensei's old teammates, who she had kept on as the woman had been in her sensei's council of advisors for almost as long as she was alive, poked her head in the door. Hokage-sama? Koharu said. Yes? She asked. If you have time, I would like you to go over the Chunin exams, Koharu said. As the Hokage is the one who decides on promotions, and Hiruzen died before any decisions were made, we weren't even sure if we should have any promotions at all this cycle, considering how the exams ended, but Danzo said that the exams were almost over, everyone was able to show off their abilities at least once, and that we should salvage at least something from the entire fiasco. She sighed as she set the paperwork she was dealing with down. Do you have the footage from the arena? She asked. Yes, we do, Koharu replied. Have it brought to me, and I will review it as well as any suggestions that were made, she replied. 15 minutes later, a TV, a VCR, and a tape with the footage from the arena was brought in by one of the numerous office Chunin along with crowd polls and her sensei's notes, which had been recovered after the invasion. The arena in which the final phase of the Chunin exams took place was one of the only actual parts of the village that was viewable on film to the general public outside of Konoha. All films and shows set in Konoha outside of the Chunin exams were actually filmed in a back lot near the Fire Country capital. She bit back tears as her sensei opened the third phase of the exams, oblivious to the fact that his murderer was standing right next to him plotting his demise. She would have to view this as objectively as she could, and she couldn't let the knowledge of what happened a few hours later cloud her judgment. It wasn't necessarily those who had the most impressive fights that earned promotions. If that had been the case, her entire team wouldn't have passed on their first try. It was those who displayed strategic thinking, forward planning, and several other skills necessary for leadership that were promoted. The first fight was Uzumaki Naruto vs Hyuga Neji, and it was almost painful to watch. With the Uchiha gone, the Hyuga were the top contenders for the title of Konoha's most powerful clan. By all accounts, Hyuga Neji, who had been Rookie of the Year for his graduating class, had been the best the Hyuga clan had produced in generations. That didn't show here, however. The arrogant boy with the supposedly all-seeing eyes who had aired his clan's dirty laundry for the entire continent to see never once noticed that he was being led along by the nose until he'd been snapped into a particularly nasty but non-lethal trap. During that fight, Naruto showed excellent strategic skills and good situational awareness as well as good risk assessment. Rather than charging at his opponent who would have shut him down with the Jukin, he had sent in several clones to deal with the boy while he prepared a number of useful traps. Not only that, but he had picked out one of the Hyuga clan's more powerful techniques until he'd found a weakness. Not the best place to do so, but much better a comrade here than a sufficiently imaginative enemy on the battlefield. The second fight had been Rock Lee vs Kankuro of Suna. The fight would be amazing if you were a civilian or a competitive ninjutsu enthusiast. On the battlefield, however, Rock Lee was damn lucky to be alive. The boy was talented. Exceedingly so. To have gotten as far as he had on taijutsu alone was simply phenomenal. It had been the bonus score the boy had gotten on the taijutsu portion of the academy graduation exam that had allowed him to graduate despite getting a 0 on the ninjutsu portion. Bonus scores in the taijutsu section of that exam were rare and almost impossible to get. The boy needed a little polish, though. Going straight into a fight without forward planning or any apparent strategy was a good way to get you and your team killed. Such fights happened sometimes despite a ninja's best efforts, but it was always a good idea to have a basic idea of what you are going to be doing before doing it. Kankuro of Suna's skills with his puppets were well and good, but he too was still a little too rash. It wasn't her job to decide whether or not someone from Suna deserved a promotion, however, that was the Kazekage's job. The fight between Aburame Shino and Naro Shikamura had been rather short, but she was reasonably certain that she'd seen enough. The Aburame Kikachu Swarm was a near-perfect counter to the Nara Cage main technique. Neither boy went straight into battle. Instead, both boys took the time to size each other up and work out their strategies. That was if the Nara boy hadn't had his planned out to the last millisecond a month in advance. The fight, when it happened, was lightning quick and was over in a matter of moments. The Nara boy trapped the Aburame boy in his cage main jutsu at almost the same time that the Aburame boy trapped the Nara in his swarm of Kikachu. The Nara could have taken a kill shot that would have resulted in a double knockout but had quit instead, knowing such an action would have been a somewhat pointless gesture on his part, as both he and his opponent would have been unnecessarily injured. Beyond the incredibly quick fight, both the Nara and the Aburame boys' records spoke for themselves. The Aburame was one of the most talented in his generation amongst the Aburame, and well ranked when compared to the rest of his generation in Konoha as a whole. The Nara boy was lazy, but had a mind that was either on par with or possibly even surpassed that of his father. The fight between Hirano Sakura and Temari of Suna was interesting to say the least. Sakura showed signs of forward planning, as she had gotten in close range with someone who was by accounts a long-range fighter. Both that and the genjutsu she'd used showed signs of intelligence. The only problem was that the girl didn't know when to quit. The girl didn't know when it was best to give ground, back away, and regroup. Her taijutsu skills did show a great deal of promise, though. The fact that she was willing to work in several dirty tricks was rather interesting. She was a girl to watch in the future. As with Kankuro, it wasn't her job to determine whether or not Temari was worthy of promotion. The fifth fight had been Uchiha Sasuke vs Gaara of Suna. Sasuke seemed to be more of a leap before you look type person, much like Rock Lee. In fact, the boy's taijutsu style during the fight seemed to be a near copy of Lee's. Sasuke was fast, agile, put on an impressive show, but didn't show much in the way of caution. Then again, his teacher wasn't the sort to lead by example in that area. As the old saying went, you become a genin again when you become a jounin. Jounin were allowed to throw many of the rules they had picked up on their way to becoming chunin out the window along with the dress code, as by the time they reached that stage they were strong enough to survive just about anything except say another jounin, or a determined band of chunin. Kakashi was one of the jounin who had done so. The points Sasuke earned in her book for the small amount of caution he'd shown initially were lost again when the boy had run off after his opponent and team during the start of the invasion. Gaara, like his siblings, was not her problem. After the last of the fights was over, she turned to the crowd polls, the notes from various dignitaries, and the notes her sensei had made. All three of them pretty much confirmed her decision. She took her decision to her council of advisors, and they pretty much agreed with her assessment. There had been some minor quibbling on one of her choices, but fortunately her sensei's notes had backed her up. If her sensei had believed him to be ready, who are they to say otherwise, especially when she agreed? Getting out the forms, she wrote up 3 promotions, sent in the requests for 3 Chunin vests adult size small, and 3 uniform vouchers. Once this was done, she sent for Aburame Shino, Nara Shikamaru, and Uzumaki Naruto. Chapter 42, Chunin. Shino stood outside the Hokage's office wondering why he had been chosen for promotion alongside Shikamaru and the Uzumaki. The Uzumaki had more experience as a genin than he and Shikamaru put together, and had even taken on and defeated an A-ranked missing nin. Shikamaru was an absolute genius when it came to tactics, and would have been Rookie of the Year instead of Uchiha Sasuke if he hadn't found the academy graduation exam troublesome and only done the minimum required to pass. He was rather inexperienced, and somewhat hot-headed for an Aburame. During the invasion, he had gone into a fight not just for the defense of Konoha, but also because he'd been robbed of his chance to deal with his chosen opponent in the arena during the 3rd phase of the Chunin exams. The Suna puppeteer Kankuro had angered him, and insulted 2 of his teammates during the month-long hiatus between the 2nd and 3rd phases of the Chunin exams. He had planned on getting his revenge for this during the quarterfinals, as he'd honestly believed that Rock Lee would lose to the boy. That was not to be, however. When the invasion started, he had taken his opportunity to go after the other boy and get his revenge. His doing so may have worked out to the advantage of those who were hoping to assist Uchiha Sasuke in his fight against Gaara, but still, his motives in that fight hadn't been as untainted as they should have been. Konoha should have come first in his mind on that day. Revenge should have come last or not at all. While he felt honored that he was thought to be ready to attain this particular milestone in his life as a shinobi, he knew in his heart that he wasn't, not quite yet. Shikamaru sighed as he stood outside the door to the Hokage's office, waiting for the new Godame to call him in. He had the sneaking suspicion that he'd only been promoted because the people who helped the Hokage make these decisions thought that he wouldn't sign up to take the Chunin exams a second time. Considering how they had gone this time, though, he studied the other 2 who were to be promoted alongside him as he waited. Uzumaki Naruto seemed more than ready for this promotion, which many of the older shinobi believed had been too long in coming. Most of the wild nature the boy had possessed in the academy had been tamed and channeled into more productive areas. The love of pranks had been turned into a trapping specialty, and the unpredictability he possessed had been carefully pruned and cultivated. The rambunctiousness and argumentativeness that had been ever-present back during his academy days still showed on occasion, as his mouthing off to Ibiki of all people proved, but for the most part it had been curbed. The academy had done the Uzumaki no favors. The changes that had come about since the Uzumaki boy's graduation had been due to the patient work of someone who had the time to work with the boy one-on-one far more often than Yumino-sensei had been able to with the class he also had to manage. as well as more than 2.5 years of hands-on experience in the field. The Uzumaki boy was a hands-on learner who did better with individual instruction. If Uzumaki had graduated with a year rather than just barely scraping an early pass by the skin of his teeth, there was a strong possibility that all that would have changed about the Uzumaki Naruto he'd known in the academy would have been his age. It was entirely possible that the boy would have failed to graduate the academy altogether if he'd stayed on, as the boy did not flourish in a classroom situation, especially a classroom situation in which he was unpopular and almost universally disliked by his instructors. Yumino sensei, who genuinely cared about the Uzumaki, would have been able to mitigate some of the damage, but not enough. The man had both arrived too late, and hadn't been able to give the Uzumaki what he needed because he had to divide his attention amongst 26 other students as well. Aburaim Shino would make a somewhat average Chunin at this point. He was at a level most shinobi were at when they started out as Chunin, though he was a little bit younger than many of them, as on average, promotion to Chunin generally happened during one's mid to late teens. There were outliers on either end of the scale, but the Aburaim wasn't really one of them. While he was one of the best his clan had produced this generation, he wasn't one of those rare geniuses that meteorically shot through the ranks like Hatake Kakashi, for instance. But he had the potential to become a top-ranked jounin later on as he honed his skills. Based on the micro-expressions that were currently crossing what he could see of his face, the Aburaim boy did not believe himself ready for this promotion. He honestly wasn't certain about his promotion either. Being a Chunin and handling all of the new responsibilities that came with the position was going to be troublesome. Naruto's heart felt like it was trying to escape from its chest when the doors to the Hokage's office opened. The day he had been waiting for, the day he'd been longing for, the day he'd almost been pining for since Satoshi and Suzume had come home in brand new vests a year ago, had finally arrived. He could hardly believe it. He'd finally been promoted. He was going to be a Chunin. After a time that seemed both an instant and an eternity, he was standing between Shikamaru and Aburaim Shino, whom he hadn't known all that well, in a line in front of the Hokage's desk and being presented with his own vest. "I do not believe that I am ready for this," the Aburaim boy said when his vest was presented to him. "The shinobi who watched you during the exams believed you to be ready. Your former instructors believed you to be ready. The council believed you to be ready, and most importantly, I believe you to be ready. In fact, the only person there were any questions over promoting this cycle was Nara Shikamaru," the Hokage replied as she firmly pressed the vest into the boy's hands. The Aburaim boy accepted his vest with a bow, while Shikamaru tried to hide his slightly chagrined expression. All too soon, the short ceremony was over, and he was headed down to supply to cash in his uniform voucher. The uniform that the quartermaster handed him smelled slightly musty, but that was probably because there hadn't been a male Chunin his size in years. While he was going to be 13 soon, he was still roughly the size of a 10-year-old, which was the youngest age an academy student could graduate at since certain laws had been passed more than 4 years ago. He raced into the nearest restroom to put his new uniform on, since it only smelled like it had been kept in a corner that didn't have adequate climate control for a while, which was something he could handle for the rest of the day since he was feeling too impatient to wait for it to be washed and dried, which would take forever, and threw his vest on over it. Once he was done dressing, he checked himself in the mirror. Even though the vest was a little large, he looked good. After a second glance in the mirror, he stashed his old clothes in a storage scroll he'd had on him, slipped the scroll into one of his new vest scroll pockets, and raced out the door and across the village. The looks he received as he raced through the village were the tiniest bit different this time. Some people didn't even seem to recognize him for a second or two. A couple people looked as if they'd seen a ghost as he passed by them as well. Behind him, whispers of "He's a Chunin? And it's about time," trailed in his wake. Before he knew it, he was at the home of the first of his precious people that he wanted to tell about his new rank. Tetsuo had just put his daughter down for a nap when someone started pounding on the door so hard that he was almost afraid that they would knock it off its hinges. It was rattling violently in its frame with each knock as it was. When he flung the door open to give the person on the other side a piece of his mind, he found Naruto on his doorstep. It took him a full second to process what the boy was wearing, and when he did he found himself saying something completely different from what he had been planning on saying only seconds earlier. "Congratulations, Naruto," he said as he pulled the boy who smelled faintly of mildew for some reason that he probably didn't want to know the answer to into a hug. "I knew you could do it. Let's go find Suzume and Satoshi and celebrate." He turned back into the house, told his wife where he was going, and grabbed his wallet. An hour later, he and Naruto were seated at the bar he'd taken his team to when they had celebrated Satoshi's and Suzume's promotions. With them was Satoshi, Suzume, Kurosaki who had been with Satoshi when they found him, the Haruno girl who had been with Suzume when they found her, the academy instructor Yumino Irika whom they'd run into on the way, Jiraiya who'd most likely heard about Naruto's promotion from the Hokage, Kakashi who'd come in with Jiraiya, and the honored grandson Konoha who had managed to sneak in somehow and was being supervised by the academy instructor to make sure he didn't sneak any alcoholic drinks. To Naruto, they, and several other shinobi who had decided to join in on the celebrations cried as they raised their glasses. At another table, there was a responding to Shikamaru. From the former and current Ino Shikacho teams and the friends they had with them. They raised their glasses to that as well. Naruto felt slightly buzzed even hours after the drinking stopped, and they had finally all gone home from celebrating his and Shikamaru's promotions. He assumed that the Aburaim had held a private celebration elsewhere. His nine-tailed occupant wouldn't let him get poisoned, but he also wouldn't do anything about alcohol unless it reached toxic levels, or the resulting hangover, as he had discovered as he once gotten himself drunk to see what it was like, and exactly how impaired he would be in that state. The party had been excellent. In the beginning, there had been two separate groups, one to celebrate with him and the other to celebrate with Shikamaru, but they had eventually merged together as time passed, and he and Shikamaru had eventually found themselves seated side by side as his and Shikamaru's friends toasted the both of them. Eventually, they had been forced to leave when they had run out of the cash they had on hand and the bartender had refused to take a check. He found one reason to be glad he didn't have living parents at the end of the party when he watched as Shikamaru had been forced to drag his heavily intoxicated father home because the man's friends were too drunk to support him themselves. He was about ready to go to bed, but he had a chore to finish first in the laundry room. After pulling his laundry out of the dryer and folding it, he placed his new uniform at the top of the pile. He'd have to get a couple more for use while on duty which he would have to pay for out of pocket. But he thought that this one would always be his favorite despite the fact that it looked to have had a previous owner who didn't seem to have used it that much, and some practical joker had sewn Uchiha Itachi's name into the collar. After putting his clothes away, he pulled on his nice warm pajamas that were fresh from the dryer and crawled into bed. There was work to be done tomorrow, and there would undoubtedly be pain and suffering down the road as he took on more difficult missions, but today had been absolutely perfect. Chapter 43, Dissolution. Kakashi sighed as he signed the papers before handing them over to the office nin to be properly filed. His team was gone, and while part of him said good riddance, another part was already starting to miss them. Naruto had been promoted to Chunin less than a week before, and as Jiraiya had claimed to him due to an apprenticeship contract that Naruto was stunned to have learned had come into existence the instant he'd signed the Toad summoning scroll, he had been unable to keep him. There was no way in hell he was going to take one of the brats from the upcoming autumn cycle to fill the space where Naruto should have been, even if there had been one to spare. With that in mind, he had decided to divest himself of the team that had pretty much fallen apart before it could even form. He had done his best to make amends with Naruto. Whether or not their relationship could return to the friendly state it had been in before he'd forced the child onto his team was yet to be seen. The boy could hold a grudge better than Kushina-san, and he had done much to earn Minato-sensei's son's ill will. He had hope, though. After he'd given what for him was an abject apology, though few would recognize it as such, Naruto had told him that he was still one of his precious people. Sakura seemed to be happy about how things were turning out, as she had been wanting a transfer to the medical corps since Wave, as she had informed him when he told her he wasn't going to be her sensei any longer. Sasuke wasn't too happy about the way things were, and he kinda understood. The kid kept losing everyone who came into his life, and now he had lost the team he hadn't wanted to be on in the first place as well almost the instant he had gotten used to his situation. Well, that had been a bust. He muttered as he left the Hokage Tower the instant his business was concluded. And people wondered why he constantly refused to take any genin teams. Sakura's heart sped up as she entered the hospital with her paperwork in hand. Today, she would be starting her formal training as a medic. One of the biggest reasons for her excitement was that Tsunade-sama herself would be teaching some of the classes, and her apprentice Shizen would be teaching others. If she could catch the eye of one or both of them, it was possible that one of them would take her on as their personal student. There were several people who were going to be in the classes with her who were just as good as her in every area if not better, and they too would be vying for such a position. If she was to even have the slightest chance of reaching her goal, she would have to do better than her best, and more than excel. She could do this. She had to do this. There were people who believed in her, and she could not let them down. Naruto grumbled as he followed Jiraiya out of the gates. That whole apprenticeship thing had been a nasty trick to pull, but considering what he'd been doing at the time, he'd gotten what he deserved. Turnabout was fair play, as they say. Sometimes you con them, and sometimes they conned you. Spending an indeterminate amount of time in Jiraiya's company wasn't his idea of fun, but Jiraiya assured him that this particular training trip was vitally important since he would be introducing him to a number of his contacts in his intelligence network. Despite all of his faults, Jiraiya was Konoha's top intelligence agent, and apparently he would be passing the reins on to him even though he wasn't sure he wanted them. The skills he would need to learn to manage an intelligence network would be necessary for when he became Hokage though, so learn he would. Jiraiya assured him that they wouldn't be gone too long, and he would hold him to that promise. Sasuke scowled. He was Uchiha, he was an elite, he wasn't someone to be cast aside and then used to fill a gap. That's what had happened to him, however. Apparently, he and Sakura had been used to fill gaps on a team that consisted of Naruto when Team 7 was formed. As soon as Naruto had gotten promoted, Kakashi had gotten rid of them, and he'd been used to fill another gap. This time, it was on Team 8. He had been sent here to take the Abiram's place since he too had gotten promoted, while he, the Uchiha who should have been promoted instead, had yet again been left in the dust. He knew why he'd been placed on Team 8 rather than handed over to one of the numerous Jounin who had been clamoring to take him on as apprentice. Kakashi seemed to think that he needed to be around kids his own age, and Kurenai was Konoha's top genjutsu expert. He'd rather be on his own with one of the other Jounin. That was not to be, however, since orders were orders, and if he tried getting around those orders by leaving the village, which was pretty much the only way he could do so right now, as Kakashi had assured him that if he tried to skip out on any team meetings or training sessions he would personally hunt him down and drag him to Kurenai. Both Konoha and those assholes who tried to kidnap him recently would be hunting him down. Why those morons who tried to kidnap him had thought he'd accept Orochimaru's offer, he did not know. The promise of power had been rather tempting for a few seconds until he remembered that it was the clever ninja who tended to live longer and win more fights in the long run, and that nobody offers something like that for free. With someone like Orochimaru, there would be some conditions attached to the offer that he didn't even want to think about, and there most assuredly would be a very large price to pay for services rendered in the end. He was stuck on Team 8 until he persuaded the Hokage to give him a transfer. Considering how difficult it was to get an appointment with the woman, he could be stuck waiting a very long time. That's it for part 9. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.